Welcome to Journaling with Nature, the podcast for those who want to turn curiosity into wonder, a pencil sketch into a rabbit hole of discovery, a moment of stillness into a life full of joy. I'm your host, Bethan Burton. Let's open the pages of our nature journals and explore this world together. Hello, this is episode 179. I hope you're doing well today. Here in Brisbane, we're preparing for a cyclone, which is coming in the next few days. So that's going to be interesting. I'm actually quite happy that I haven't done too much work on my garden preparing for the growing season, because who knows what it will look like after the cyclone. We'll see. I'll keep you updated. Today, I'm bringing you a conversation with writer, scientist, and natural historian Angela E. Douglas. Angela grew up in the UK and is now living in the USA, and Angela's nature writing very much focuses on the local, in particular her own backyard. This conversation is a celebration of the power of the local and what we can find when we tune in and pay attention to the small happenings around us in our local area. Let's listen. Angela, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure, Bethan, and I look forward to this conversation enormously.
Yes, me too. I really have. I loved your book, and we're going to dive into the story of your writing and writing about place and about very local nature. But first, I would love to hear some stories about your connection with nature in your early years. I wonder if you can share some memories of nature back in the UK.
Of course. I was very lucky in many ways. I had the natural world of my childhood was idyllic. I grew up in the New Forest, which is on the south coast of England. And my first memories are stomping through muddy, wet heathland in rubber boots. And there were purple, the heather was purple, it was in flower, and the prickly gorse was bright yellow. And I mean, at the time, I'm sure I wouldn't have identified it as cotton grass, and insect-eating sundews, and I have memories of flocks of lapwings and curlews, and there were stonechats and linnets, and I took it all for granted. And there was a lot of woodland, mostly birch and oak, and streams with minnows, and what I would now call vernal ponds, that is temporary ponds, and there would be frog spawn in spring. I can just go on and on.
Yeah.
I mean, I collected the frog spawn and I took it home, and there were tadpoles in little bowls, and of course, in due course, they became carnivorous, and I tied little bits of meat with cotton and dangled it into the water, and then when they were starting to metamorphose into frogs, I distinctly remember my father insisting that the bucket had to go back down to the wet area because we weren't going to have all these frogs sitting around in our veranda. And it was wonderful. It was really wonderful. Holiday makers would come down, times of public holidays, and there was a campsite at the far end of the village, and it always rained at that time, but I don't remember it raining any other time. It was wonderful.
That sounds absolutely idyllic, and it does sound like you have just a lifelong habit of noticing nature and paying attention. And then I'd love to talk a little about your career, because you went into a career as an entomologist. You studied symbiotic relationships between insects and bacteria. Again, this is very detailed noticing, and I'd love for you to talk a little about that career.
I'm very happy to. It was actually a little more complicated than that.
Tell me.
But you're right that I always knew I wanted to be a biologist. It never occurred to me to be anything else, because nothing was as important as the natural world. I mean, I could be kind of interested in history and, how many wives Henry VIII had and things like that. But nothing was important like living creatures. And at university, as you said, I got very interested in symbiosis, meaning beneficial interactions between different organisms. And at the time, this was highly unfashionable. Everyone knew that what made the world go round was antagonistic interactions. So predation and competition and parasitism. And beneficial interactions were just curiosities of nature. I actually started off being really interested in associations between animals and photosynthetic algae. So basically animals that photosynthesize. We were all taught, the difference between animals and plants, and the key thing about animals was that they ate and they didn't photosynthesize. And then I discovered that there were all these wonderful photosynthetic animals, photosynthetic by associating with photosynthetic algae. And of course, the most obvious and important of those photosynthetic animals are corals. So I spent a number of years researching various types of associations, but also including corals. And at that time I had opportunities and I visited Australia, but I never actually worked on Australian corals. I worked on corals from other parts of the world. And then I slipped sideways and started working on insects associated with bacteria, and had a wonderful time doing that as well. I particularly worked on aphids, sort of green fly or black fly, which are absolutely dependent on their symbiotic microorganisms, and so on. And a job opportunity came up here in the US, and well, here I am.
Yeah, so you made this big move because of your job, and then suddenly you're out of the UK and into the USA, and you move to Ithaca, you buy a house in rural upstate New York, and there you are, you're experiencing a whole new set of animals and plants and living organisms. And I would love for you to tell the story of, so you bought a house there, but you bought the house without knowing about this garden that was going to become so important. So can you tell the story of buying this house, having no idea about the garden because I think it was covered in snow when you bought the house, and then the moment of discovering the garden?
Yes, we were completely, my husband and I, we were just being crazy. We visited here in February, which is the coldest time of year, of course, and with the intention of buying a house in a week, which it was a ludicrous idea. Yeah. But it's moving continents while you're maintaining a busy job is really hard. But even crazier than that was that the first house we looked at is this one.
Wow.
And it was perfect. And by the end of the week, with enormous help from, they're called realtors here. They're called estate agents in the UK. She was really helpful to us, and she guided us through this business. But we bought the house.
Yeah.
The trouble was that the garden was under a foot of snow, and we had no idea what was there.
That's amazing.
Yes, and it could have been terrible, but thank goodness it was. We came back in August, and it's hot in August. It's sort of almost like summer in Brisbane, sort of hot and sweaty, and we discovered that it was just what we wanted. It was rather neglected, but it wasn't bramble and poison ivy. It was just wildlife neglect. And we have done rather little other than enjoy it ever since.
Oh, that's amazing. And so this garden became the focus of your writing and your life for a while during the 2020 lockdowns, and you started this writing project, which ended up becoming your beautiful book, Nature on the Doorstep, A Year of Letters. And I would love for you to talk about the beginnings of this writing project during the 2020 lockdowns and how the garden became so important.
Yes. In fact, I know precisely when it all started. It was the first Sunday of lockdown, which was, I think if I remember correctly, the 22nd of March, 2020. And being a busy academic, I worked on Sunday mornings. So I sat down at my desk and started, and I couldn't work. I was kind of distraught, and I felt out of things. And it was totally on a whim, and people who know me know that I am not given to whims. I'm kind of a disciplined person. But on a whim, I just put all my work to one side and started writing about the previous week's events in our backyard, and particularly how the house sparrows were usurping other birds at our bird feeder. Now, goodness knows why it was just crazy. I'd never done anything like this. And I suppose it was a very weird time, very uncertain time.
Yeah.
And you do weird things. Anyway, I sat down to lunch with my husband as usual. And he asked me, well, did you get, the way one does, a standard under the radar sort of conversation. Did you get on well this morning with whatever it was I'd said that I'd been doing? And I said, well, no, but actually I've written this thing. And he looked at me as if I was completely mad. And I read it out to him. It was, 600 or 700 words. And it had taken me a couple of hours. And it had made me feel so good writing it. I just felt relaxed and, back in control of my life, which had been my life was out of control. Yeah. But I'd somehow acquired some sort of inner control.
Yeah.
And I made him laugh at what I'd written. Yeah. And that felt like such an achievement because neither of us had laughed. Not once through the previous week. And I think it was a couple of days later, I was emailing to family members in the UK, and I just included this to say, I've been doing crazy things. And I was just astonished by the response. I mean, my family members responded. They enjoyed it. And they responded telling me about their natural history observations. And so it was as if we had found a different way of communicating. Our life wasn't dominated by COVID and lockdown and things like that. So I just repeated this the next Sunday. I can't remember exactly what I wrote about. Oh, I know. I think it was amorous blue jays or something like that. And then the next Sunday I wrote about celandines in the backyard. And I just got into the habit of doing it, and family members were writing back with their natural history observations and their photographs, and we somehow created a parallel universe, something that was different, and it just kept going. I started it, when I wrote my second piece and my third piece, I thought, well, all of this will be over in 6 weeks.
Yeah.
It wasn't.
We didn't know, did we? Yeah.
No, we didn't know. And it turned into something totally unexpected. Now, I have written academic books before, and I have always written them with a very clear idea about what they were for, right from the beginning. Writing a book it's a very alone kind of activity, and I've always felt you only embark on it if you know that writing it will change your life. Not having written it will affect your career prospects or anything, but actually the process of writing it will change your life. And this was the first time that I wrote it without realizing I was writing a book, and it has changed my life.
Yes. It's interesting, isn't it? I love this story. I love that you had that little bit of a little bubble of something else that wasn't the worry of COVID, that wasn't the question marks and confusion that we were all feeling. It was just like, here in my backyard, this is happening. And I had the same feeling during COVID that nature continues. They don't know that we're all stressed and strung out and confused and, war, or so much conflict and all that stuff. Nature just going on. Blue jays are doing their thing. Snails are doing their thing. And that there was so much comfort in that, I found. And I love that you had that little bubble with your family and friends. Like, we can both do this. We can all be paying attention to where we are, local nature, and writing about local nature is what became important.
Totally. And our lives contracted to almost nothing.
Yeah.
We were very fortunate, of course, that we had our little back garden, or what's called a backyard here.
Yeah.
But it's very small. It's very ordinary. It's sort of surrounded by other houses on all sides, close by. We live cheek by jowl with our neighbours. There's nothing special about it at all. And yet, when you pay attention to it, there's something special going on all the time.
Yeah. And I'm sure that writing rhythm of saying, okay, now I'm going to do this, I'm going to pay attention, or even just sort of, and we talk about this in nature journaling circles, which is that you turn on that curiosity or that awareness or that readiness to pay attention. And you must have had that structure throughout your week, like, okay, what am I going to pay attention to now? And I'm sure that the activity, the structure itself was a lovely scaffolding for the week when things are kind of blobby and without structure. It must have given a lovely structure.
Yes, but also no.
Okay, tell me.
And the no part of it was because I was, of course, very busy. I was maintaining a busy academic life on Zoom, which was a miserable activity for us all. I actually didn't have time to think about it consciously.
Yeah.
I mean, my husband and I would, in the pandemic, we would at least once a day do what we called the tour of the estate, which was we'd wander around our garden together because we didn't like to go anywhere else.
Yeah.
And I suppose things were happening in the subconscious, but I only really started to think about it. I set aside time on Sunday morning to write, and I was very aware and confident that the piece would come to me. And I wasn't going to let it, I didn't have time for it to dominate my life, and I didn't want it to dominate my life through the week. So I wasn't considering my little world with a view to write. I was just considering my little world and believing that something would come, which is a very intuitive kind of way of going about things, and again, very unlike me. But it worked. It worked, and I developed this confidence that it would always come to me.
Yeah.
And of course, if it didn't matter.
Yes.
Because, I just write to my family and say, well, I didn't have anything to write about this week.
Yeah.
But it never happened. I always had something.
That's beautiful. Let's talk about the process of writing, because you have written academic books, but then there's this natural history sort of writing for yourself and the joy and the noticing. I would love to know the nitty-gritty of, like, so you say you wrote on Sunday mornings and you very much were like, this is my writing time. But I'd love to know more about what your writing style is and the difference between this kind of writing and your academic writing. It sounds like this was a deviation from the norm for you, and that's a beautiful thing, especially in a tumultuous time like that.
Totally. I mean, my academic writing is scientific papers or scientific scholarly books. I try to make it interesting, of course, but the text is dry. It's very factual. It has no personal input to it at all. So this was totally different. And the first time I wrote, I just wrote.
Yeah.
But after that, I was writing very much with my family members, and friends got involved as well. A small group, coterie of people, and I was not writing for myself, although I was writing for them.
Yeah.
And
Nice.
so it was really important to me that it held their interest, and I didn't write in a way that was difficult for people to understand. It's
Yes.
very easy as a professional biologist to write in a way that's dull and boring and incomprehensible. So it was a very different way of writing, and I was writing for people, some of whom had some biology, some had no biology, for people, I mean, my own adult children, up to people, who were, quite well on in years. And I wanted it to be attractive for all of that cross-section of different people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was in a way a little bit of a task, but that in itself made it interesting and engaging for me. It was a challenge every week.
Did you sit down?
And one that I appreciated.
Yeah. Did you sit down with something in mind? So say it was the Blue Jays. Did you sit down, okay, today I'm writing this, or did you just sort of gaze out the window and get inspired? How did you choose your subject for the week?
Well, some weeks it was very obvious. Something exciting had happened and I knew exactly what I was going to write about. Other weeks it was a little bit more sort of meandering. And it was important that the week held together as a story. It wasn't just little tidbits of snippets of this and that subject. It had to have some coherence. Yes. So it was a very strange time.
Yeah.
And I evolved a new way of writing, and one I developed the habit, and I still do it every week.
That's amazing. I also I'd love to hear you speak about traveling and writing, because I know that you travel to Australia now to visit your son, and writing and traveling, how do they match for you?
It feels very different. But I'm writing about my experience in a new and different place. I mean, when I came in September, I wrote 3 pieces, one each week.
Yeah, lovely.
And the first one, I called it Big Birds, and it was really a thought that we arrived in Sydney, and we went out to Coogee Bay, and we saw some albatrosses, and it was just wonderful. And it made me think very carefully about why is it that I find it so splendid to see albatrosses flying, but I don't feel splendid about travelling cattle class for thousands of miles from the US to Australia. I don't find that at all splendid or miraculous, but actually it is.
Yes.
So I wrote a little piece.
I love that.
Musing about how I see the world, and writing about the albatross. We also saw an Australian darter, which is another snake bird, which is another very big bird. So it was sort of thoughts about big birds and their different ways.
Yeah.
I also, the other 2 pieces I wrote, one was about sand bubblers, the crabs, the little crabs, which we didn't see them in Sydney. I don't know if they get as far south as Sydney, but we went up, while we were there, we went up to Coffs Harbour, and we saw these little balls of sand all over the beach, and we were totally unaware what they were. We'd never seen anything like it before. And so I did a little bit of work finding out about it and finding out about these crabs. And all us I sent it to the Northern Hemisphere family, and they were as amazed as we were.
I love
and the last piece I remember now was about stag's horn ferns. And we walked along this area. It was just behind the beach, a sandy beach, and it was just this amazing forest, and all the stag's horn fern just dominated the epiphytes in this area. And I called it Living Free because I'd never previously seen staghorn ferns in the wild. I'd only ever seen them sort of in houses and glass houses, and sort of all being as singleton ferns, and always strapped round and stuck to pieces of wood and things like that. And how different it was to see these ferns free and on their own. And I did a little bit of work finding out about them, and how actually they form these colonies, and there's a division of labour between the ferns at the top and the ferns at the bottom.
Wow.
And, which I'd previously been unaware of.
Yeah.
That they have a social life, and that social life is eliminated in the situations where they're propagated.
Yes.
As an ornamental plant. So I had good fun with that.
I love hearing you talk about Australian nature and the sand bubbler crab. So going onto the beach and just seeing literally thousands of tiny little balls, like half the size of a marble, everywhere. It's part of my childhood. We used to have our summers very near Coffs Harbour, and so the sand bubbler crabs, so much a part of my experience that they seem normal. But when I hear you talk about them, I think, yeah, and again, that idea of exchanging joy in local nature, it reminds you to be amazed, because that is really cool.
They are amazing. I picked up one of these little balls and it just disintegrated in my fingers. And to think that, these crabs are feeding by this sort of flotation mechanism of taking a bit of sand and squirting a bit of water and then letting the sand sediment out at the bottom and spitting it out and taking the goodies from the sand and swallowing that. I think it's wonderful. really wonderful. Cool. and then the tide comes in and
washes it away.
All the little balls are gone.
Yeah. I'm wondering, as a natural historian and as someone who, pays attention, is interested in nature and nature journaling, who are the writers that inspire you? Who are the influences that you look to?
In terms of natural history, Gilbert White, who was an 18th century parson in the south of England. And as I was writing my pieces every week, I really felt that he was sort of on my shoulder, which was quite crazy. I think it was a time when one was a bit crazy in the pandemic. But he wrote letters, and rather few natural historians write letters. And I mean, we now know that some of the letters that he wrote to his colleagues were kind of infill and fabricated to make the book. But many of them were real. And that's how I differ from Gilbert White. Every single one of these letters was written at the time and with minimal change from how it was originally written. But certainly I have read and enjoyed Gilbert White, The Natural History and Antiquities of Selborne. Which was a village about 50 miles from where I grew up. And I've known and enjoyed that book. It's very accessible, even to us centuries later today. And so I suppose he was a very big influence on me. And the other influence, of course, was Anna Comstock, who was an American lady, and she was based in Ithaca. And she wrote extensively about natural history, including a rather large book called The Handbook of Natural History, which was designed to provide lesson classes for children at that time. And I have a copy of that, and I have always found it a very useful source of information. I'm an honorary child. and she wrote many very amusing stories, about a chipmunk who made its nest in her friend's hat. So in the 1920s, women wore these sort of big hats, and she even had a picture of that. And she was dismayed by the collapse of the chestnut trees, which were being killed at that time by this fungal infection and have never recovered. And at that time, grey squirrels, which are now very common, were very rare. And she commented on this, and she was very upset, and rightly so, by the way that she felt they were being hunted to extinction. Luckily, she was wrong with the extinction bit, but because they'd come back since that particular fashion in hunting has disappeared. And so she was a very strong influence on me and the way I went about writing, because she made it her business to be entertaining.
Yeah,
so I tried to do the same. Actually, in a way that Gilbert White didn't.
Okay.
He wanted to inform.
But how beautiful that these two authors that were so influential were so close to where you lived in your youth and live now.
Yes, and both of them very much wrote in terms of local. And I think I picked up on that. But I'm making it sound as if it was very organised and I thought it through carefully, but it wasn't really like that at all.
Well, I would love to talk about, because you moved, you sort of upended your life and you started a new life in Ithaca, and you had to learn, and I don't mean that to say, I mean that to be a negative, but you got the opportunity to learn a whole new suite of species, and I would love to hear a few examples of things that you found the same and things that you found different, and examples of surprising things that you found in your new environment, and what that was like, learning a whole new set of nature.
It's very hard. It's much easier to learn when you're young, I promise you. Yeah. You learn something one year, the summer, and the next year comes round and you've forgotten and you have to relearn it all. But the main thing about coming to North America is I was just gobsmacked by the diversity.
Yeah, okay.
There's so much diversity here. It's really wonderful. If you think about the species of trees, there's one species of oak tree. I mean, there are two in the UK, but where I grew up, and generally there was one, and there are 8 species.
Oh, wow.
They're not easy to discriminate.
Yeah.
And instead of 3 species of woodpeckers, there are 7.
Oh, yes.
In our local area. And skipper butterflies is really terrifying. There were 3 diminutive species in the UK. I mean, there might be a few more that are rare, but 3 one would come across. There are 27 species here.
Yeah.
So that's really tremendous. Of course, there are species that I'm familiar with as a European, because people in the 19th century were determined to bring all the birds of Shakespeare to North America and things like that.
Yes.
And because early colonists brought plants with them, either by accident or on purpose, what they perceived as medicinal plants. And so many of the plants of the wayside, weeds, are very familiar to me. In fact, I would like to just read out a little bit from Nature on the Doorstep about one of the plants that's very familiar. Well, no, not very familiar to me. So it's just a very small section, and I wrote it on July the 12th of 2020, and it's about a plant called the Deptford pink.
Okay.
So I'll just start.
Yeah, please.
Nowadays, I have to watch my step as I go to the washing line in the backyard. This is because I'm walking through the empire of the Deptford pink. This empire flourishes every year in July, and it's particularly vigorous this year, with some 24 plants. At the top of each stem there's a cluster of flowers, each with 5 bright pink petals, laid out in perfectly flat, as if to soak up the sun of high summer in its adopted land. The Deptford pink is an introduced plant from Western Europe, and it's very special for us. The Deptford pink is rare in the UK, so rare that we've never knowingly seen it. But here it is, thriving, uninvited, which I mean we didn't plant it, and magnificent in our backyard. The Deptford pink is a sad business in Britain, as 2 sources in our bookcase remind us. The first source is David McClintock and Richard Fitter's 1956 Collins Pocket Guide to Wildflowers. At that time, the Deptford pink was described as widespread but scarce, being restricted to dry, grassy places. And our second source is Richard Mabey's Flora Britannica from 1996, by which time the status of the Deptford pink was decidedly rare. The really wonderful thing about our Deptford pinks is that their empire in our backyard is not so special. The Deptford pink is widespread in fields and on the sides of roads, and probably in everyone's backyards, if only they didn't mow their lawns so often. Now that it's thriving, it ignores all that stiff upper lip stuff of British field guides about needing dry, sandy conditions to survive. For example, we saw flourishing Deptford pinks just next to a wet, muddy rut when walking in some rough cattle pasture in the Finger Lakes National Forest yesterday. And that's just one very particular example of what is considered uninteresting and not very special and very common to everyone around us, but for us is just extraordinary.
I'm so glad you chose that to read, because that's such a beautiful example of not only that the native plants of your younger years have become exotics in your new location, but just that reminder that this is something special, and that you have an extra layer of an extra reason to care about that or to notice it.
Yes. I mean, one's personal history should be part of one's experience of natural history in a way that it isn't for science. Your personal experience should not affect anything in science.
Yeah.
Yes. Of course, many of the plants that have been brought across from Europe or from Asia by accident or by design are noxious weeds here and are a serious problem. But those are different stories from the Deptford pink, I think.
It's so interesting hearing these stories. There was a similar one of, I have a friend in Canada, and I had posted on my social media a drawing I had done of a canna lily, which is a weed here. It's very weedy. It just is everywhere, and we pull them out because they're so frustratingly weedy. And she said in Canada that they tend to them very carefully, and they're really temperamental, and it's hard to keep them alive. And the difference in those 2 plant experiences interested me a lot.
Yes. But those, as gardeners, we do need to be very thoughtful.
Yes.
A lot of the worst examples of alien plants causing havoc in habitats are caused by people thinking, these are pretty plants, let's put them in our garden. And people have been doing this for centuries. And it can often take many decades or longer for those plants to start to become a serious problem.
I
mean, one example we have is the autumn olive.
Okay.
And it's causing a lot of trouble. And it was first introduced in the early 1800s, but it's only started to cause serious trouble in recent decades. And it's very difficult to eliminate.
Yes, once these things get out of control. Here in Australia, the British had this, back in the day, they had these things called acclimatisation societies, which was an organised group of people who were trying to turn Australia into Britain. So they deliberately released things that were familiar and made them feel like home. But then we know the end of that story.
Yes, it's not good, is it? I mean, we as gardeners, we have to be very responsible, I think.
Yes. Part of your story that I'm really interested to know about, whether you've had this experience, here in my own garden, I love to get to know individuals, not just individual species, but individual animals. And in the recent season, I had this funny relationship with an individual grasshopper that was growing on this big bushy kale. I knew where he was. When I first found him, he was very small. And then over the weeks, I knew where he was and I could find him, and he grew and grew and grew and grew. And I just let him stay on this kale and sort of connected with him, enjoyed the color of him against the kale. I'm interested to know if you got to know any individual animals in your
yes.
experience.
Oh, most definitely, and I think that's an essential part of natural history in a local natural history.
Yeah.
Whether it's an individual animal or whether it's recognizing the change of the seasons in a particular place and so on. One example that we have relates to a pair of cardinals.
Okay.
So these are birds, and they're very territorial. The male is bright red, and the female is sort of olive green with sort of orangey trim. And one year, our female cardinal saw adversaries everywhere. So we first became aware of it. It was like a woodpecker sound, but it was too tinkly. And then we discovered that what she was doing was pecking on the window of our neighbour's garage. And she saw her own reflection and was determined that this was an adversary who was coming in to take her mate away. And we called it the daily hate, because she would
she was so stressed.
She was so stressed out by it. And sometimes her mate would come and he'd see his reflection and he would also peck a little bit, but it was quite clear his reflection wasn't nearly as aggressive as hers, and he'd get bored of it very quickly. I mean, we called it the daily hate, but it was more than daily, and I can't imagine what it did to her brain.
Yeah, but also it would have been a feedback because she was attacking herself, so it would have been like,
precisely.
She's aggressive.
That's right. The more aggressive this female became, of course, the worse it became. And we tried to sort of distract her and chase her away from this. From the garage window.
That's
but that was a very particular instance of this.
I love that. That is really cool. You had this beautiful theory, or this beautiful way of articulating something, and this concept is really common in the thinking of my listener, the people in the nature journaling circles, which is what you call the circle of natural connections. And we talk about it regularly, but you've articulated it really beautifully. And I'd love for you to describe the circle of natural connections and what that means.
Yes. So there are three elements to it. And we've talked already about two of them. And we've talked about all of them, I think. One's emotional connection to nature. And that could be your grasshopper on your kale plant, or it could be something much bigger than that. So taking delight in just the whole landscape. It can be at any level, but you feel emotionally connected. And that interacts positively in both directions with finding out about it. Being able to identify your species, being able to know a little bit about them, being able to predict when and where they'll appear, and so on, that actually helps you appreciate your natural world more. And appreciating your natural world makes it more interesting to find out about it. So that is to engage in the discipline of natural history. And both of these two aspects of the way we interact with the natural world interact in turn with our commitment to take care of our natural world. and to be good stewards. So the more emotionally invested we are, the more we want to be good stewards. And being good stewards actually helps us to be emotionally connected. And being good stewards also interacts in both directions in the same way with finding out about our natural world. So I called it the circle of connections because that is very much how I see it.
Yes.
There's no beginning and there's no end to this.
Yeah, this is beautifully articulated. We talk about stewardship a lot in nature journaling circles, and that exactly what you articulated, that love for nature grows when you pay attention, and that love is what helps you stay motivated. And I love that this. Do you know what I love about your work, Angela? Is the localness of it. That this works just as much in your backyard. In fact, probably more in your backyard than in a wilderness area that you visit.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. Can you talk about that? About the localness and the need for us to engage in this way. And in fact, this is your words. You say, adopt a mindset of engagement to pay attention. So this engagement and this paying attention locally is what drives it more than a one-off wilderness experience to somewhere.
Totally. If we're going to make a habit of paying attention and being responsible for our natural world, it has to be a habit that is every day. Yeah. Every other day. Yeah. It can't be a habit that is born of going in an aeroplane to a distant place and taking lots of photographs of a beautiful place and then disappearing. It has to be the natural world that we should be most invested in is what happens here and now in our day-to-day lives. And it should, I think it should be part of our lives, an integral part of our lives. Everywhere is local for someone.
Yes. This is beautiful.
So I think that your world in Brisbane, it feels so exotic to me. And maybe my little world in Ithaca feels different and special to you.
Absolutely.
And, this isn't, caring for the natural world isn't something for heroes. Maybe it is for a few heroes, but for most of us, it should be just paying attention and caring for our local world and hoping that other people will do the same for their local world. And that's very much how I see it, yes.
That's beautifully articulated. And you've already said, as gardeners, we have to be very mindful and very careful about how we show up, how we tend to the nature in our care. But you also do advocate for something you call the art of strategic neglect, which is such a cute, such a beautiful way to articulate it. You mentioned that not mowing as vigorously or regularly can help encourage different plants. But I'd love to. You also say lower your standards a little with the garden, and I just think that is so lovely because it's when nature gets to have a little go without being completely controlled and manicured, that beautiful habitats spring up. I'd love to hear you talk about the art of strategic neglect in the garden.
Very much so. So this comes back again to the issue of we don't have to be heroes to achieve things. For most of us, I'm an ordinary person and I'm very fortunate to have a small back garden. And so I have very little control over what happens at a large scale. But I do have a lot of control over what I can offer in this tiny little, small patch of land. And so, and the wonderful thing is you don't have to put a lot of work and effort into it. I mean, if you want to, you're welcome to, but you can just neglect it and just let it go its own way and do its own thing. But you have to be a little strategic in your neglect. If I totally neglected it, there's a invasive from the UK called garlic mustard here, which is, it would just smother everything. And, you know, I just pick them out. They're very easy to pull out. But, and there are one or two other things that, you know, one has to be a bit strategic about. But by and large, just let your garden do its own thing. It won't look terribly smart. Your neighbours' gardens will be much more colourful and bright and beautiful than yours. But it is a haven for wildlife. You know, if you're just a little bit less tidy than needs be. So for us, you know, making sure to leave some of the dead leaves on the ground so that, you know, they're good places for creatures to hide through our cold winters and so on. When plants are finished flowering, you don't have to deadhead them. Just let them just remain. They may be skeletons through the winter, but that's all right. You know, there'll be creatures who will be overwintering inside those dead stems, and birds will enjoy the seeds. I mean, often, you know, the seeds of some plants are neglected by birds at the beginning of the winter, but by the end of the winter, they're hungry and they will go for things that are, you know, less palatable. So, yeah.
And I also think
that strategic neglect is definitely the way to look after a garden.
This is beautiful. And I do think that you can learn to love and see beauty in these things as well. You know, you say the neighbour's garden will be more manicured than yours, but I think that especially as nature journalists and natural historians, that we can see all the beauty and all the stages. So a flower that's been dead and is decaying and changing its form and changing colour, I think those things, especially with this mindset that we've been talking about, you start to see the beauty in that, and that's a special thing.
I think you're completely right, that it's all about letting nature take its course and not trying to convert it into your living room. Think about people hoovering their lawns and doing the equivalent of dusting their flower beds. You really don't have to do that.
So I'd love to talk next about your new book. You've got a new book coming out soon.
Oh, yes, okay.
Near the Forest by the Lake, Discovering Nature Close to Home. Again, we're continuing on this theme of beautiful, paying attention to local nature. Can you talk a little about your new book?
Yes, I'm very happy to. So, as I mentioned, habits are very hard to break. And I find myself just carrying on writing about 1,000 words every week, and it gives me enormous pleasure. Again, I allowed these essays to accumulate, and I collected together a set of 4 essays about the local area for each month of the year. And I thought about them in terms of asking myself what I truly value about the natural world. And I discovered that really I don't have a succinct answer to that. And the answer is always caught up in the particular. And so these 4x12, these 48 essays are really talking about what I value about my local natural world. So at one level, it's very local, but at another level, particularly with the introduction and the postscript, it's really talking about the power of local and the power of the particular and the byways and the fun of the natural world. And, you know, I like to think of the natural world as the greatest show on earth.
Absolutely.
Well, it is, isn't it? I mean, what greater show can there be than that? Yes. And to describe, so I admire you so much for your talent at painting and drawing. I have to paint in words. I have to sing in words. I have no other, you know, I don't have any facility for anything other than words, really. So I'm attempting to project the importance and the value of the local world in this book, yes.
And writing and drawing, they're two sides of the same thing, which is paying attention to the local. And I just love that we can express ourselves in different ways, and yet we're both doing the same thing. We're paying attention and celebrating, in a way, celebrating the greatest show on earth.
Yes, it is. It is a celebration. And being simultaneously very aware of how the human fingerprint is everywhere, for better or worse.
Yes.
And accepting it for what it is and thinking carefully about our contribution to ensuring that fingerprint is as benign as possible going forward.
Yeah.
Yes.
Amazing.
Yes.
Angela, I can't wait to read the book, and I have really thoroughly enjoyed chatting to you and diving into these subjects that are so close to my heart, and I just love hearing the ideas and the concepts expressed in your words. Thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much. It's been the greatest pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Angela. I adore her focus on local nature and the gentle ways that we can let natural history become part of our lives. It goes back again and again to what we know in nature journaling, which is that noticing, this simple and powerful act, will bring our lives so much depth of connection and joy. The more we notice, the more connected we are, and the more we want to protect our natural spaces, and around on what Angela calls the circle of natural connections. So let this conversation be a reminder to pay attention, although I know that if you're a listener here, that this practice is already an important part of your life. So today, step outside and notice something, one of the many nature stories that are playing out right outside the door. Please head to the show notes to find links to Angela's website and to where you can pre-order her new book, which is called Near the Forest by the Lake, Discovering Nature Close to Home. Thank you so much for listening. See you next week.